Hello, this is Matthew Haskett for Business, Government, and Society. We're going to talk about the growing gender equality as a problem in business and society. Let's get started. There's some major points we want to talk about. First, how the issue is viewed politically, economically, and socially. Second, current events that have taken place that make this a big issue. Next, why the problem continues to grow. And lastly, how to move forward. First, how is it viewed? There's three primary perspectives in my opinion. The liberal perspective, which is the loudest voice. This is the politically correct voice. In the framework of business, government, society, this is largely countervailing forces. There's a little bit of classical liberalism in there that economic and social freedoms will lead to equality, but there's a huge emphasis that push through protest will encourage the government to hold business accountable for when they're failing in this issue. And lastly, there are environmental catalysts that fuel momentum. This can be the news cycle, such as the Me Too movement, which we'll discuss in a little bit, but war and natural disasters also play a part. There's a conservative perspective, and that is a somewhat diverse politically and philosophically group, but not so much ethnically. There's small government centrists, which is basically what's left over of the Democrats that switched to Republican during the Nixon era. There's social conservatives. This is the moral majority, people that are largely white Protestant Christians. There's American libertarians, which are essentially classic liberalists, just in a unique American sense. And then there's the radical right. The radical right wants to push back civil rights, and that includes gender protections. This is seen as a fringe group, but in fact they're on the rise, and I think we see that with the Trump era and a lot of his supporters. This is largely a market capitalist concept of the world. There's just a huge emphasis on classic liberalism, the idea that we said before, that the liberals tend to agree with as well, that economic and social freedoms will lead to equality. But for conservatives, this is faith-based, and this is Darwinism. This is basically the rule of humanity. Lastly, there's a leftist perspective. This is not as common in the United States as it was over the past 100 years, and it led to great change in the United States. They believe in more radical approaches to change. They have roots in communist theory, socialism, anarchism, and the civil rights movement. It's different than liberalism, which is what often is considered on the left. Leftists typically believe in direct action versus petition. And this has to do with how they view the world. And they view the world through a structuralist perspective. And when you look at business, government, society, this is clearly a dominance model. They focus on class and power as being what's dividing the world. And because of this, many on the left will emphasize class over identity and identity politics, which of course includes gender. There's been two major current issues that have been through the news cycle in the past decade. The major one recently is the Me Too movement, given its name for the hashtag MeToo used on Twitter, a social network. It was most recently triggered by Ronan Farrow's coverage of Harvey Weinstein, a famous movie producer, and his treatment of women. The entire movement, though, really boils down to sexual harassment in the workplace. It's been a rallying call to liberals, and conservatives have no coherent message on this issue. They still believe the market should decide. If you're harassed, you should get another job, is sort of what their perspective boils down to. At best, there's actually far more worse opinions that they have. Leftists, though, are quick to point out harassment in the workplace is based on power disparities. Although the vast majority of cases involve women, the existence of cases of men and LGBT harassment highlight that it's more than just an issue of gender to them. The second big issue, which hasn't been spoken about since, or at least as aggressively since the last presidential election, is the wage gap. What is it? It's basically the concept that women are paid more than or less than men. And why is it the case? Well, there's a lot of different explanations. There's typically a ratio given, 77 cents to a dollar. There's been studies by the Department of Labor, and people have taken those statistics and just broke them down per capita, and that's how we've come up with those numbers. But there's been a lot of research to show that those numbers don't necessarily paint a good picture of what's going on. This, of course, has been an issue that liberals have really been pushing. The conservatives specifically don't seem to be all that concerned about it. Once again, they think that the economy is the way to fix it. So when we're critical of the wage gap analysis, and when we fix for education level, full-time, part-time, and things like that, the American Association of University Women found that the difference is really closer to maybe 82 to 100% or 93 to 100%. The problem with that analysis actually reveals something striking about how we look at this issue, and that is that we have to separate education level and work hours without understanding that there is a intrinsic segregation in work in the United States to where women are doing certain types of jobs that are valued less than men. It's not that women can't do the jobs that men do. It's that women are choosing to do different jobs, and many of those jobs are less paid, which I think is a problem within itself. For this reason, I believe that the wage gap actually is far more important than people really discuss, and I think it's often framed completely inaccurately. It doesn't have anything to do with negotiating salaries. It doesn't have anything to do with what we're good at genetically or what we're good at intrinsically gender wise. It has something more to do with how we see our roles in society. So why do these problems continue to grow? Okay, that's pretty simple. It's because neither of the major American political factions offer solutions to the problem. And this really consists of the liberals and the conservatives, and a sort of partisan fight between them that's extremely polarizing. One group sees the economy as the only way to fix the issue. The other group sees the government as a way to fix the issue, but they want the government to basically simply regulate business that will then carry out desirable outcomes. But these small fixes are really not going to have a great impact on making gender be less of an issue at the workplace. It's just going to continue to slow to a crawl, and every single fix is going to lead to another large issue. So moving forward, I think there are places to look, and you might have guessed that I think we should look at the perspectives that leftists have had over the last roughly 50 years. Specifically, the way they've linked gender and power dynamics, I think, explains a lot of this issue. They call into question the accepted hierarchies of bureaucratic structures of both business and government. One particular author, David Graeber, did a great book called The Utopia of Rules. He analyzes how bureaucracy's efficiency works against empowering low-level employees, which of course you're going to find protected classes such as women. And Graeber does something very interesting. He draws from critical race theory and critical feminist theory to explain in more detail why this is such a big issue. In terms of critical race theory, which isn't really the topic here, he talks a lot about Bell Hooks, a famous author and activist, both feminist and activist for African American rights and minority rights. But what I think is most interesting here, and especially why gender factors in so importantly, is his discussion of feminist standpoint theory. Okay. Now, feminist standpoint theory is deeply rooted in Marxism and structuralism. The crux of it is that women have an epistemic privilege over men that leads to inefficiencies in the workplace. And this is difficult to explain, but to sum it up, because women are a class that has been lacking in rights for so long, women have to create special strategies to survive in society. And through the creation of those strategies, they have created answers to major problems we have. But due to their lack of ability to proceed and gain power within the hierarchy, they can't help us solve those problems with their solutions. This is probably, I see, as the main solution and why gender is such a main issue. And I totally agree with this perspective. I think that it's going to take more than the basic political solutions that we accept in the United States. I think the Me Too movement has galvanized a lot of women into direct action, specifically women running for political office. This is far different than being a large voting bloc. Being in positions of political power will allow them to exert force from the top and hopefully create some more equitable solutions to the current issues. So thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and take care.